My name's Adam Cox. I'm the founder and managing director of Radio Relations, a radio PR specialist that's part of the Relations Group. We have spokespeople in our studios literally every week. You know, sometimes as many as 10. I think the record that we've had is about 15 different interview sessions taking place in a single week. So therefore, you know, it's quite often that I'll be asked, you know, do you have any tips to enable the spokesperson we have in your studios to get more out of the radio interviews? So generally I say there's 5 key tips that I would recommend for anyone, whether it's with us or with anyone else, doing radio interviews to get the very most you can out of that time. And the first tip is to prepare. So that's tip number 1, prepare. And it's really good to really prepare the story and to prepare the sound bites. Really know what the story is about, because to comply with Ofcom regulations, the story can't be about your product or your brand. It has to be a story in and of itself. So really understand the story. If you've done research, really get to know that research and really have everything that you need to be able to have a conversation around that. So the first key thing is prepare. My tip number 2 is to be aware that there are different types of interviews. Yes, you get those kind of BBC or community radio station live interviews where when you connect with the radio station, it's going out live on air at that specific time. Now these interviews tend to be very much conversational interviews. They will ask questions, they'll go back and forth, and it tends to be much more conversational in tone. Whereas sometimes you'll get interviews from a news desk or a newsroom and their voice won't be heard on the radio. So they're very interested in sound bites, and that's why it's always worth preparing the sound bites in advance, because what they're looking for is 15 to 20 second snippets that really sum up what the story is and how it relates to their audience, and that can be very useful to kind of prepare. Now what can sound strange is that if you're expecting a conversational interview and then you're actually doing an interview with a newsroom, it can almost sound like they're distant or uninterested because it lacks that conversational flow. But simply by being aware of the news-based interviews compared to the actual feature or more conversational-based interviews means that actually you'll be much more able to deliver the content to the radio station in the way that they want it. So tip number 2 is be aware that there are different types of interviews and give them the content accordingly. My tip number 3 to get the very most out of radio interviews is not to read. Now what can happen if people are slightly nervous perhaps is that they have lots of notes. They've got lots of notes, they've got lots of information, and they can be a crutch, they can be a support. And the tendency I've seen in some cases is to actually use the notes and read verbatim actually the key messages or the key things that you want to get across. And that doesn't sound very natural. It sounds like a very forced piece of content. So my advice would be to have your notes to hand if you need them, but actually to treat it very much like a conversation. So a radio interview is very, very similar to a phone conversation. It's just that the microphone is the same as the kind of bit that you're talking into the phone, and the earphones are the same that you would actually listen to the phone. So treat it like a phone conversation, because that's all it really is, albeit a very high quality phone line that comes across in studio quality. And if you were having a phone conversation with someone that you already knew, you're not going to rely on notes. And because of that, it's going to flow much more easier, it's going to be better to listen to. So I would say don't read, but have notes to hand if you need additional support or preparation for those interviews. And also be aware that even live interviews, you know, it's better to come across natural by looking at notes. Whereas when you're doing those pre-recorded interviews, you could always ask the interviewer to wait a moment, look at your notes, and then prepare your soundbite accordingly. So don't feel that you can't, you know, have additional information available. I would say just don't rely on it. Tip number 4 is really to think about the radio station and their audience and to create as much value as you can. Now the value is going to come from the content, from your tone, from the information and the resources that you provide. And a tendency can be, when you're doing a radio interview, to kind of focus too much on your objective. And your objective might be to deliver a key message to a particular audience and really plug the brand. Now that might be your objective, but for this to really work well, it has to be a win-win. And the way that you actually will get a natural opportunity to deliver your message and get your brand across is by actually creating value. So really focus on the story, focus on what the problem is, and then naturally lead in to the solution of that problem, which may very well be research that you've conducted, what your brand or product is, but it has to be editorially justified. So try and create as much value for the radio station and the audience as you can, rather than focusing too much on what your objective is. So my final tip number 5, relates to plugging or your brand mentions. And as I've mentioned, the radio industry in the UK is regulated by Ofcom. The BBC radio stations have their own editorial guidelines, and even commercial groups have compliance teams and certain rules that they have to follow. And one of the key Ofcom rules is about commercial brand mentions. It is a breach of their license to broadcast if they give undue prominence to a brand. Now the caveat here is that if a story is editorially justified and a brand can actually naturally link to a particular topic or theme, then it complies with Ofcom regulations. Typically, there are 3 natural ways during a radio interview that you can get your brand across. And way number 1, the first way, is normally how the spokesperson is introduced. So generally, they would ask the name and position of the spokesperson, and normally that's because either for a live or a pre-recorded interview, they're going to introduce the person that was on air. That's how you get brand mention number 1. Brand mention number 2 typically is going to relate to any research or new information that you have. So if you'd commissioned a poll or a new survey, for example, then you would attribute that poll or research to your brand. So you'll say research commissioned by, insert your brand, shows that, and then try and make it as locally relevant as possible, because the more locally relevant that you make that content, the more appealing it's going to be to the radio station that broadcasts in that area. Again, another Ofcom requirement is that they have enough local content. So own the research and make it locally relevant whenever you're doing a local interview. And then the third way that you get your brand across is where people can find out more information. So generally when we're creating news releases or what we call a cue sheet, the final question will be where can people find out more information? And by having that as the final question, you could say, well look, for more information you can visit our website. Generally what I recommend is that you have 2 sources of more information. One that is not your own resource, so it could be a charity, it could be a third party, so that when you give your own resource, it's seen as being more impartial and therefore more credible. But that tends to be the third natural way. I would urge you not to treat a radio interview like brand bingo, where the goal is to get as many brand mentions across. Because actually, what you would do is you will actually burn a bridge between your brand and that radio station, where they would lose trust. And I've been involved in radio interviews where the spokesperson clearly is trying to communicate their brand as much as they possibly can. And for live interviews, particularly the BBC, they will just end those interviews early and wind them down. Whereas when you have a spokesperson that's trying to create as much value as possible, they have a nice conversational tone, they're aware of the different interview types, and they're really trying to create the most engaging interview topic that they can. Typically, they tend to get more brand mentions and more key messages across anyway as a side effect of a good interview, rather than trying to force it. So my overall tips would be relax, enjoy the experience, treat it like a conversation, and just prepare as much as you can. And what we tend to do anyway for our clients before we have them in the studio is we do a mock interview before. We help them prepare, we give them feedback, and we're also with them in the studio. So even if the first 1 or 2 interviews are not quite at the level that they need to be, we'll be able to give them feedback so the subsequent interviews get better and better. It's not just about doing the interviews, it's about doing them in a way that really creates value for the radio station and really delivers the right message to the right audience at the right time. For more information on radio interview campaigns, you can visit the Radio Relations website, which is radiorelations.co.uk, or just call us in the office.